The new girl doesn't belong here. That's what Dr. Sterling told the two residents trailing behind him on the fourth day of Katie Morrison's employment at Sacred Heart Hospital in Denver, and he said it loud enough that everyone within 15 feet of the ICU nurse's station could hear the contempt wrapped around every syllable. Katie's hands froze over the patient chart she'd been organizing by acuity level, her fingers stilling mid-motion above a stack of intake forms, but she didn't look up. She'd learned in 3 weeks that looking up was an invitation. Looking up meant eye contact. Eye contact meant conversation. Conversation meant questions about where she came from, what she'd done before nursing, why her personnel file was so sparse it looked like someone had taken an eraser to her entire history. So she kept her gaze fixed on the chart in front of her, on the neat rows of vital signs and medication lists, and let her other senses catalogue the moment instead. The antiseptic smell that had been burning her nostrils since 6 a.m. that morning, sharp as a blade. The soft squeak of Sterling's Italian leather shoes against the tile floor as he moved closer. The way the fluorescent lights hummed their constant, exhausting frequency overhead, a sound like electricity grinding against itself. 3 weeks at Sacred Heart had taught Katie Morrison how to become invisible. She'd arrived on a Monday with a single suitcase, a renewed nursing license, and the deliberate intention of being nobody worth remembering. The apartment was small, 2 rooms that smelled like other people's lives, an industrial carpet cleaner. The job posting had been perfect because it asked nothing about her past, just credentials and references, and she provided those with the careful vagueness of someone who'd learned how to disappear. The hospital's ICU was modern enough, 12 beds arranged in a semicircle around the central station, each room isolated by glass walls and heavy curtains. Equipment hummed and beeped in a constant mechanical chorus. Ventilators wheezed their rhythmic support. The heart monitors kept their steady percussion. She'd worked in trauma centers before, though she couldn't tell anyone that, and the rhythm of crisis was something she could move through without thinking. Her muscle memory recognized the setup. Her hands knew where to find things. Her eyes could scan a patient's vitals and make triage decisions in the time it took most nurses to read the first line of a chart. But Dr. Sterling didn't see any of that. He saw a woman with brown hair pulled back in a tight bun, scrubs that were clean but not new, and a name badge that had been laminated less than a month ago. He saw someone who kept her head down. Someone who didn't make jokes in the break room. Someone who didn't attend the monthly happy hours where the hospital staff cemented their social hierarchies over overpriced cocktails. He saw weakness. What Dr. Sterling did not see was the faded unit patch sewn inside the lining of Katie's jacket, the one hanging in her locker downstairs, a patch that had traveled through 2 wars and come home on less than half the shoulders that carried it out. He didn't see the surgical precision in how her hands moved when she organized those charts, grouping them not by room number like the other nurses, but by acuity, by risk, by who needed intervention first. He didn't see the way her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly whenever she opened a supply cabinet and found the inventory wrong again. Premium equipment marked on the manifest. Cheaper substitutes actually stocked. Numbers that didn't add up. Supplies that didn't match their own documentation. She'd noticed the pattern 3 days in, had noted it mentally without reporting it, understanding in the way only someone trained in operational security could understand that certain observations were dangerous to voice out loud. "Miss Morrison," Sterling said, and it wasn't a greeting. It was a declaration. The 2 residents behind him, younger men in shorter white coats, one of them looking nervous, the other mirroring Sterling's expression with the eagerness of someone still learning the hierarchy, turned their attention toward her. "Perhaps you could explain why the trauma bay inventory you logged yesterday doesn't match what procurement says we ordered." His voice had the texture of expensive education and inherited authority, the kind of voice that expected compliance the way gravity expected objects to fall. Katie set the chart down with the careful deliberation of someone who'd learned the value of measured movements. She turned to face them, and her eyes made brief contact with Sterling's before sliding to a point somewhere above his left shoulder. The trembling in her hands had stopped. She'd trained it out of herself years ago, had learned in places with names she couldn't speak aloud to keep her hand steady even when every nerve fiber was screaming to move, to act, to respond. The premium grade sets were received, Katie said quietly, keeping her voice level and sparse. "I logged them. They're stored in the locked cabinet. She paused. The cheaper substitutes are what's actually stocked on the carts. The words hung in the air like a mistake. She should have let it go. She should have smiled apologetically and blamed the discrepancy on a data entry error. She should have made it Sterling's problem to solve, not hers to name. But the pattern had been bothering her. The inventory was wrong in ways that suggested intention, not accident. Someone was deliberately ordering one thing and stocking another, and the only reason to do that was money. The only reason to create that gap was profit. And the way Sterling's face shifted, a brief tightening around the eyes, a sudden increase in his respiratory rate, told her she'd just said something he didn't want her to have noticed. "You're new," one of the residents said, attempting something like friendliness. "The inventory system here is pretty complex." He was offering her an off-ramp, a chance to backpedal, to accept the excuse he was providing. But Katie had already learned in those 3 weeks that backing down from truth just meant learning to accept smaller lies. It meant becoming complicit. It meant standing in the middle of a hospital where people's lives hung on precision and accepting that someone was cutting corners for money. "No, it's not," Katie said, and then she turned back to her charts, the conversation finished from her perspective. Sterling's expensive shoes didn't move. He stood there for another 3 seconds, she counted them in her head, a habit from her old life, before he turned and walked away, the resident scrambling to follow. His voice carried back to the station as he moved down the corridor, speaking to them in low tones, and even without hearing the specific words, Katie understood the message. She'd just made an enemy of the man who controlled this ICU. She'd just marked herself as the kind of nurse who asked questions. The kind of person who noticed things. The kind of employee who was going to be a problem. The fluorescent lights continued their grinding hum above her head. A ventilator wheezed in room 7. A heart monitor beeped its steady rhythm in room 3, and Katie returned to her charts, her hands moving with the precision of someone trained to compartmentalize, to function even when the situation was about to change. She didn't know yet that the Army Ranger in room 4, Lieutenant Marcus Webb, 6 weeks post-extraction from a failed operation, lungs still healing from blast fragmentation, was her son's commanding officer. She didn't know that he'd kept Daniel alive through 2 deployments in places that had names and didn't have names, that he'd carried her son through firefights that would have broken anyone less trained, less determined. She didn't know that seeing his name on the patient roster would eventually become the thread that unraveled her anonymity. Right now, she just knew that the ICU was the safest place to hide, that the work was straightforward and honorable, and that she'd just taken her first step toward losing it. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that she was right about the inventory. The worst part was that Sterling's reaction had told her everything she needed to know about who was orchestrating the discrepancies and why. The worst part was that she'd just become the only nurse on the floor who understood what was actually happening, and that knowledge, in a hospital run by a man with that much to lose, was the most dangerous thing she could possess. Katie pulled the next chart toward her, and her hand was steady as a surgical laser. The lunch rush at Sacred Heart hit like a wave, the cafeteria filled with the clatter of trays, the hum of fluorescent lights, the smell of institutional beef stroganoff mixing with coffee and hand sanitizer. Katie moved through the line with her tray, keeping her head level, her movements economical. 3 weeks in. 22 days of watching Dr. Sterling move through the hospital like he owned the title and the air around it. She'd learned to anticipate his patterns, the way predators telegraph their strikes. That's when his voice cut across the noise, loud, deliberate, pitched to carry. $200, Sterling announced to the 2 residents flanking him, his tailored suit pressed sharp enough to draw blood. Says the new girl quits within a week. Morrison, that's her name. You see that look? That fragile thing. He gestured toward Katie without looking at her. She's got that haunted quality. Doesn't belong in acute care. The residents laughed, the automatic, practiced laugh of people dependent on his referrals, his recommendations, his goodwill. One of them actually pulled out his wallet. The sound of cash being slapped on the table carried further than Sterling's voice. Katie felt every eye in the cafeteria pivot toward her. 3 tables of nurses and techs and residents, all turning to watch the new girl's reaction. The air changed, not just temperature, but something chemical, like the moment before a storm system makes landfall. She kept moving. Kept her face level. Her hands didn't shake as she reached for a plate of salad she wouldn't eat. Sterling stepped directly into her path. It wasn't accidental. His shoulder connected with hers, a check, the kind delivered in controlled violence, and her tray tipped. Crashed. The sound of shattering ceramic was swallowed by the sudden silence that descended on the entire cafeteria. Soup splashed across the tile floor in a pattern like arterial spray. Silverware scattered. A bowl rolled under a table and came to rest against someone's boot. Clumsy, Sterling said, stepping over the mess without breaking stride. Katie knelt, reaching for the scattered pieces. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was steady. She'd done harder things than this in sandstorms with bullets snapping overhead, but this public humiliation in front of people who had power over her employment, required a different kind of discipline. She reached for a piece of ceramic. Dr. Sterling dropped her patient charts at her feet. They scattered into the soup, papers absorbing liquid, the corners curling instantly. He smirked down at her, his expression the comfortable cruelty of someone who'd never faced consequences. "Pick that up, sweetheart," he said. Katie felt the moment arrive like a door swinging open. She could stay on her knees. She could apologize. She could let him see fear. She could give him what he was hunting for, the break, the crack, the proof that he'd been right about her from the start. She took one measured breath instead. She let a single tear escape, let it track down her cheek without stopping her work. She wiped it away with the back of her hand, never breaking eye contact with Sterling, and when she spoke, her voice came out steady as a surgical laser, steady as muscle memory from 17 years of command decisions. "I've cleaned up worse messes than this, Doctor." The cafeteria went dead silent. Not the silence of breath held in anticipation, but the silence of a room realizing it had just witnessed something it didn't have a framework for. Sterling's expression flickered, surprise, then calculation, then something that looked like anger trying to find its shape. He turned away, his jaw working, and Katie returned to gathering the ruined charts and scattered food. Around her, no one spoke. No one moved. The only sound was the ceramic pieces clicking against the tile as she collected them, her movements precise, unhurried. She didn't shake until she reached the break room. Even then, it was just her hands, and only for 30 seconds. She sat on the bench by the lockers, pressed her palms flat against her thighs, and waited for her nervous system to remember that she'd survived worse than a cafeteria, worse than a condescending doctor, worse than public humiliation. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, a text from the ICU charge nurse asking about a medication dose, and by the time she typed her response, she was solid again. Intact. Operational. But Sterling, she understood, was not done. Men like him didn't accept being answered back, especially not in front of witnesses, especially not with that kind of composure. The calculation she'd seen in his eyes meant something concrete was about to happen. The next day proved her right. During morning rounds on the cardiac unit, Sterling stopped beside her as she reached for a chart, and his voice carried, casual, cutting, across the nursing station. "You sure you're cut out for critical care, Shaky?" he asked the residents, loud enough for the whole floor to hear. "Look at those hands. You see that tremor? Maybe try pediatrics. Less pressure. Might be more your speed." Katie's hands weren't trembling. They were steady, had been steady for weeks. But she'd learned something from the cafeteria: sometimes the fastest way through a trap is to not argue. She absorbed the comment like armor absorbs shrapnel. It hit, but didn't penetrate. She said nothing, continued reviewing the chart, continued her work. Sterling watched for a moment, waiting for a reaction, then moved on. The residents shuffled after him like satellite organisms following a gravitational pull. On her 5th day, he found her at the supply closet. She was restocking 14-gauge angiocath needles, trauma supplies, the kind used for emergency procedures, when Sterling appeared in the doorway, blocking it completely. He was large in the way expensive fitness memberships made men large, broad-shouldered and shaped by purpose. But it was his eyes that carried weight, the eyes of someone calculating odds, measuring threats, deciding on a move. "I've been looking at your file, Morrison," he said, moving closer until the air between them became something that could be measured in inches. "Pretty thin. No references worth mentioning. Makes me wonder what you're running from." Katie turned to face him, the box of needles still in her hands. She could see the strategy underneath his words. He was testing, probing, looking for the flinch that would tell him where her breaking point lived. She met his eyes without wavering, and when she spoke, her voice was quiet, which somehow made it carry further. "I'm not running from anything, Dr. Sterling. I'm walking toward something." For a moment, she saw something flicker in his expression, recognition, maybe, or the first spark of understanding that he'd misjudged his opponent. Then it was gone, replaced by a smile that had no warmth in it, that was less a smile than a baring of teeth. "We'll see how long that lasts," he said, and stepped aside to let her pass. But that wasn't the worst part. That wasn't the moment that changed everything. Katie finished her shift and headed to the ICU supply room to photograph the inventory sheet she'd been documenting, the discrepancies in the premium chest tubes, the pattern of expensive equipment ordered and cheaper brands substituted, the billing that didn't match the actual supplies. Sacred Heart was being invoiced for equipment that never arrived, equipment that went somewhere else, somewhere that benefited Dr. Sterling and someone on the supply company end. She had her phone out, had the first sheet in focus, when the charge nurse's voice crackled over the overhead speaker. "Code Blue. ICU 7. Post-op Ranger, acute decompensation." Katie's hand stopped shaking for the first time in 3 weeks. She moved without thinking, muscle memory taking over like it always did when lives hung in the balance. The supply room was forgotten. The inventory evidence was forgotten. Everything except the clinical facts contracted her world to a single point of focus: Bed 7, acute emergency, immediate intervention required. She ran. The ICU hallway stretched in front of her with terrible clarity, every shadow sharp, every sound distinct. The code team was already forming, the resident, Chen, first year, hands that had probably never performed anything more serious than a central line, standing frozen at the bedside. The patient was a ranger, maybe 30, with shrapnel removal scars still fresh, and his chest wall was sucking inward like something was pulling from inside him. His lips were the color of slate. His oxygen saturation was 68 and dropping. Tension pneumothorax. The clinical diagnosis was simple. The survival rate without immediate intervention was not. "Get me a 14-gauge needle," Katie said, already tearing open the supply drawer. "Intercostal access kit, now." Chen stammered something about calling for the attending, about protocol, about waiting for backup. Katie didn't hear him. Her hands moved with the terrifying fluid precision of apex predators, muscle memory from field trauma, from combat zones where hesitation killed people, from the kind of experience that lived in your bones and didn't ask for permission. She counted ribs with her fingers, located the second intercostal space at the midclavicular line, and performed the needle decompression with the confidence of someone who'd done it in sandstorms with bullets snapping overhead. The hiss of air escaping. The patient's oxygen saturation climbing instantly, 72, 78, 84. His color returning like someone flipping a switch. His eyes clearing. His breathing stabilizing. "Where did you learn that?" Chen whispered, staring at her like she'd materialized from another dimension. Katie's hand started shaking again, the adrenaline crash hitting her like a truck hitting a building. She needed coffee. She needed to sit down. She needed about 5 minutes before her nervous system remembered how to be integrated. "Trauma rotation," she said, and walked out before he could ask more questions. What she didn't see, Dr. Sterling in the hallway, watching through the observation window. Didn't see his phone already in his hand. Didn't see his expression shift from professional interest to something darker, something that looked like calculation mixed with threat. By the time Katie reached the staff bathroom and finally let herself feel the tremor in her hands, Sterling had already made the first call, to the Board of Medicine, to the hospital administration, to the network of people who owed him favors. The wheels were already turning. The knives were already being sharpened. The third shift at Sacred Heart stretched quiet and thin, the kind of night when the hospital breathed differently, fluorescent lights humming their electric monotone, ventilators wheezed their mechanical rhythms, and the supply room became a cathedral of antiseptic silence. Katie Morrison stood at the steel shelving unit, restocking the ICU inventory like she had 100 times before, her movements automatic and practiced. A bear hugger warming blanket. A box of 14-gauge angiocath needles. Level 1 rapid infusers stacked 3 high. Her eyes caught on the chest tube kits again, and this time she didn't look away. The pattern had been bothering her for days, a whisper in the back of her mind that wouldn't quiet. Premium equipment ordered, cheaper substitutes delivered. She pulled down the current month's inventory log from the shelf, her index finger running down the SKU numbers with the precision of someone trained to notice inconsistencies in equipment manifests. Billing records showed Sacred Heart charged for drain tube premium kits at $847 per unit. Superior collection chamber design. Graduated measurement markings every 50 milliliters. Anti-clotting mechanisms that reduced thrombotic complications by 34% in published studies. Katie opened the cardboard box in front of her and examined what was actually inside. Generic brand. Unmarked chambers. No anti-clotting membranes. The kind of equipment that worked fine if nothing went wrong. The kind that got people killed when everything did. Her jaw clenched once. Just once. Then she photographed the serial numbers and the billing records with her phone, her hand steady as a surgical laser. She didn't need to understand the full machinery of Sterling's scheme yet. She just needed to see it clearly. 23 premiums ordered this month. 23 generics delivered. The markup on each one was roughly $600. The kickback Sterling was likely receiving, 30–40% of that markup, meant he was pocketing somewhere north of $4,000 per order. That was 23 orders. That was approximately $92,000 in a single month. That was a scheme so brazen it required people who didn't ask questions, people who didn't look, people who didn't care about what the hospital was actually billing versus what patients were actually receiving. Katie shelved the equipment with care and returned to the floor. 2:02 a.m. on a Thursday. The ICU held 7 patients, for ventilators, 2 dialysis machines, and Lieutenant Marcus Webb in bed 4, whose chest wall had been moving differently the past 6 hours. Subtle at first, a slight asymmetry in his breathing pattern, the left side moving slightly less than the right. She'd been checking on him every 20 minutes, watching his oxygen saturation creep down with the slowness of a sinking ship, 98%, then 96%, then 94%. His pressures holding steady, but something underneath them was changing, some physical process unfolding beneath his ribs that protocol hadn't yet named. The monitors caught it first. The ventilator alarm screamed its warning at 3:14 a.m., a shrieking electronic wail that jerked the night shift from their fog. Katie was moving before the sound finished its first cry, her body already in motion because her hands remembered what her mind was still processing. Webb's chest wall was pulling inward now, the left side caving with each breath like a fist collapsing around a lung. Tension pneumothorax. Air in the pleural space with nowhere to go, pressure building with every breath, compressing the lung, pushing the heart, cutting off the blood supply with the efficiency of a tourniquet. His oxygen saturation read 68% and falling. His heart rate was 156, tachycardic, panicked. The covering resident froze. Dr. Patel stood at the doorway to Webb's room, staring at the monitors with the slack-jawed expression of someone whose training had evaporated the moment real danger arrived. His mouth moved without sound. His hands hung at his sides. Katie didn't wait for authorization. She didn't wait for him to remember how to be a doctor. She grabbed a 14-gauge needle from the crash cart, her movements the kind of smooth and terrible precision that comes from having done this before in sandstorms with rounds passing overhead, with dust in her teeth and a soldier's chest caving the same way Webb's was caving now. She prepped the injection site at the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, her fingers finding the landmarks by muscle memory. "Step back," she said to Patel, and it wasn't a request. It was the kind of command that made the resident move without questioning why someone wearing a scrub badge that said nurse was speaking with the authority of someone who'd given orders for 23 years. She inserted the needle with one smooth motion. The breath of air that escaped, the hiss of pressure releasing, the sound of death stepping back, was the most beautiful sound she'd heard since she'd walked away from that life. Webb's chest wall stopped collapsing. The air came hissing out of the needle like a sigh of relief, and Katie was already turning to grab a catheter, already threading it into place, already taping it down with tape from her pocket. Muscle memory took over, every step automatic, every movement from a time when she had authority and equipment and a radio in her ear telling her that the soldier in front of her would either live or die based on what her hands did in the next 40 seconds. Sinus rhythm. The monitors steadied. O2 sat climbing, 72. 79, 85, 92. Blood pressure stabilizing. Heart rate dropping from that panicked 156 down to 104, then 98. Webb's color came back, the grayness bleeding out of his face, the life returning like a switch being flipped. The whole thing took 90 seconds. From code to stability in the time it took most people to tie their shoes. Patel's voice came from somewhere behind her, weak and small and wondering, where did you learn to do that? Katie didn't answer. She was already moving to the monitor, already checking the numbers, already running through the mental checklist of what came next: chest x-ray to confirm placement, watch for infection, prepare for chest tube placement if conservative management failed. Her hands were doing the work while her mind was somewhere else entirely, somewhere cold and distant, watching herself as if from above, watching this nurse in her scrubs who knew things no nurse should know, who moved like someone trained by an institution that didn't have time for hesitation. She needed to report this through the system. Document the procedure. Wake up the attending. Follow protocol. But some part of her, the part that had been trained in dark rooms by people whose names she'd never learned, knew that protocol had already been broken. Knew that she'd stepped outside the careful line she'd drawn when she'd walked away. Knew that Dr. Sterling would see this and understand exactly what it meant, and that understanding was going to cost her everything. By 6:48 a.m., before her shift ended, before she could even finish her charting, her phone buzzed with a text from the charge nurse. Administrator wants to see you in her office at 2 p.m. Investigator arriving this morning. The next words out of Sterling's mouth, she would learn later, had been spoken loud enough for the nursing station to hear. Patient safety comes first, and we can't have cowboys in this hospital, no matter how lucky they get. Luck. That's what he would call it. That's what he would call the muscle memory of keeping soldiers alive in places where the margin between alive and dead was measured in seconds, where you either knew how to move or you didn't, where hesitation was a death sentence for the person in front of you. Luck. Katie finished checking the monitors. Webb's color was good now, his oxygen saturation steady at 94% on the ventilator, his heart rate normal, his body doing what healthy bodies do when someone gives them the chance. She didn't know yet that Sterling had already begun his counterattack with the precision of a man who understood institutional power the way she understood medicine, that he was already making phone calls, that he was already sharpening the knives that would cut her loose from the only place she'd felt safe in 3 weeks. She just stood at the foot of Webb's bed and watched him breathe, this Army Ranger who she didn't know, who had worked with her son through 2 deployments and kept him alive, and whose life she'd just saved with her hands, and whose very existence was about to bring everything she'd buried screaming back to the surface. The machines beeped their steady rhythm. The night shift ended. The day shift arrived. And somewhere in the administrative corridors of Sacred Heart, a man with everything to lose was already making phone calls. By 6 in the morning, Dr. Sterling's phone calls were already in motion. He dialed the hospital administrator from his car in the parking garage, still wearing yesterday's clothes, eyes red-rimmed with the particular fury of a man watching his empire crack. His voice on the phone was ice and silk. "Jim, it's Richard. We have a serious problem with one of your new nurses. Katie Morrison. 4th day on staff and she's already performing unauthorized procedures on critical patients without attending physician approval." A pause. Sterling knew how to use silence. "I'm concerned about her credentials. I think you need to open an investigation immediately." For liability purposes. Jim Patterson, the administrator, was already awake. He was always awake before 6. But hearing Richard Sterling's voice, Richard Sterling who had sent him 3 patients last month, Richard Sterling whose referral network kept the orthopedic wing booked solid, made his stomach clench. What kind of unauthorized procedure? Sterling exhaled slowly. Needle decompression on a tension pneumothorax. Correct procedure, technically, but she performed it without orders, without documentation, and I'm questioning whether someone with her background is even qualified to make those decisions. The implication hung there, maybe her credentials weren't what they claimed. Maybe there was a problem. Maybe this could become bigger than it was. By 7 in the morning, Sterling had called 3 board members, men he'd guided toward hospital contracts worth millions, men who understood reciprocity. He didn't need to ask directly. A careful mention of serious concerns about credential verification and the potential legal liability was enough. By 8, the board members were already texting Jim Patterson, asking questions. By 9, Patterson called in his director of nursing. By 10, he called legal. The machine was moving, gears turning with the quiet efficiency of institutional power. Sterling's next call was methodical. He contacted the 2 nursing homes where Katie had worked before, the sparse references she'd listed on her application. He didn't ask directly. He was more careful than that. He mentioned some inconsistencies in her personnel file and spoke vaguely about instability issues he'd heard about, creating impressions without making statements, planting seeds of doubt that would take root in the minds of people he'd never met but who understood that Richard Sterling didn't call about people he didn't know for any reason. 1 reference check became 2, became 3, each one reinforcing the narrative. Something was wrong with Katie Morrison. Something was unstable. The final stroke came at 11 o'clock when Sterling called in an outside investigator, a former hospital administrator he'd hired for exactly this kind of situation. I need you to review a nurse's credentials and her performance file. I have concerns about potential fraud. The investigator, a man named Chen with grey at his temples and a decade of terminating problem employees, arrived by 1 in the afternoon. He spent 2 hours building a case that didn't exist, manufacturing documentation of an unauthorized procedure, cross-referencing Katie's references against her stated background, finding inconsistencies that were only inconsistencies because he was looking for them. By 2 o'clock, he had a preliminary report recommending immediate suspension pending criminal investigation. The language was legal and damning, pattern of falsification and unauthorized medical practice. At 2:30, hospital security appeared at Katie's station. A supervisor and 2 officers. No anger, no drama. Just efficient institutional power. Katie Morrison. She turned, instinctively knowing, some part of her had been waiting for this moment since the needle went in. You're suspended pending investigation. You'll need to clear out your locker and vacate the premises immediately. Her hand started to shake then, the first time all day. She tried to focus on what they were saying, something about legal representation, about the investigation, about not discussing this with staff, but the words were muffled. Like she was underwater. She reached for her locker and they stood there watching while she pulled out her things, a photo of Daniel in his dress uniform, a worn copy of the ACLS manual, a spare scrub top. They wouldn't let her clean out anything else, wouldn't let her say goodbye to the nurses who'd started to trust her. Just walked her out with the efficiency of removing a problem. The drive home took 20 minutes but felt like hours. Her hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that by the time she pulled into her apartment parking lot, her knuckles were white and her fingernails had left red crescents in her palms. The apartment was quiet. Daniel was still deployed, she thought. Or he had been. She'd gotten a text that morning that he was on leave, home for 2 weeks, but she'd been so focused on the night shift, on Lieutenant Webb, on staying alive in the ER that she hadn't processed it properly. She dropped her bag by the kitchen table and her legs just gave out. She sat down, still in her scrubs, still wearing the hospital badge they'd forgotten to take back, and the crying started. Not the controlled, single tear she'd managed in the cafeteria. This was different. This was everything breaking at once. The accusation. The humiliation. The lies about her background. The knowledge that she'd tried to start over, had tried to be just a nurse, and it still wasn't enough. It was never going to be enough. She didn't hear the door open. Didn't hear Daniel's duffel bag hit the floor or his footsteps across the tile. Just felt the world shift when she looked up through her tears and saw her son standing in the kitchen doorway in his Army Ranger dress uniform, face going from smile to shock in a single breath. He'd come home early. Some last-minute leave, he'd said in his text. Surprise Mom before she got to work. Spend time at home. But now he was looking at his mother, the woman who'd raised him alone, who'd never shown weakness, never broken, never let anything defeat her, and she was sobbing into her hands at the kitchen table like the world had ended. Mom. His voice cracked. Why are you home early? Katie couldn't answer. Her throat was closed. The words were ash. Daniel dropped to his knees beside her chair, his dress uniform pristine and perfect, and she was suddenly aware that she was still in her scrubs, still in the clothes she'd been suspended in, still wearing the badge of a hospital that had just thrown her away. Mom, what happened? Daniel's hands were on her shoulders and his voice was different now, not the young soldier but the son, the man who understood something had broken. Katie tried to speak but the sobs came harder instead, the kind that shake your whole body, the kind that come from surviving things no one should have to survive. It took her 5 minutes to find her voice. Then she told him everything, the inventory discrepancies, Dr. Sterling's scheme, the patient in the ICU, the needle decompression, the life she'd saved. She told him about the phone call this morning, the investigator, the suspension, the security escort like she was a criminal. What she didn't tell him was the specific patient's name, because the charts had only listed L. Webb, Army Ranger, and she hadn't made the connection yet. The sound of helicopter rotors outside her window that night, a Black Hawk descending toward the hospital helipad, came before the realization would. Daniel's face went white, then red, his hands clenching into fists. They fired you for saving someone's life. Suspended, Katie whispered. They say I falsified my credentials. That I performed an unauthorized procedure. That's insane. Daniel stood up, pacing, his boots making sharp sounds on the kitchen tile. You're the best nurse in that hospital. He stopped. Looked at his mother. Understood that this was different than a normal accusation. Understanding began to dawn on his face. They know, don't they? Someone knows what you were. What you are. Katie didn't answer because she didn't know. She just sat there in her scrubs, suspended and disgraced and home at 2:30 in the afternoon when she should have been on the afternoon shift. That night, Daniel made phone calls Katie pretended not to hear. Virginia area codes. People she didn't know. The conversations were brief and cryptic but his voice had changed by the end of the night, harder, sharper, like a soldier calling in a favor from people who understood the stakes. Katie tried to sleep but couldn't. Just lay in her bed listening to the rain hammer against the window, listening to her son protect her the way she'd protected him. By morning, her phone would ring with a number she hadn't seen in 3 years. 3 days after her suspension, Katie heard it. The unmistakable sound of rotor blades cutting through Denver air like a knife through silk. She stood at her apartment window, 10 blocks from Sacred Heart, watching the Black Hawk descend toward the hospital's rooftop helipad. The helicopter hung there, impossibly massive against the gray afternoon sky, and her heart rate climbed with the precision of a monitor tracking a failing patient. That sound. She hadn't heard it in 4 years. Not since the day she'd signed the discharge papers and walked away from everything. Her phone rang before the rotors had even begun to slow. The number was one she'd memorized but never expected to see light up her screen again. She stared at it for 2 rings, then answered. Senior Chief. The voice was clipped, military, carrying the weight of command. We need you at Sacred Heart. Lieutenant Webb is asking for you by name. Katie's breath caught. Webb. The Army Ranger in her ICU. The man she'd saved with needle decompression at 2:16 in the morning. She'd never told him her name before he was sedated. She'd never said anything except the necessary words, "Stay with me. You're going to be fine." How did he? 15 minutes, Senior Chief. The hospital lobby. Your son is already there. The line went dead. Katie moved on muscle memory that had nothing to do with nursing. She changed out of her apartment clothes and into fresh scrubs, her hands steady as surgical lasers, her breathing controlled. She caught her reflection in the mirror, tired eyes, set jaw, the face of someone who'd learned to disappear in plain sight. Not yet. Not anymore. The drive to Sacred Heart took 8 minutes. She parked in the garage and walked through the employee entrance, her badge still in her pocket even though she'd been ordered not to use it. The corridors smelled like antiseptic and something else, something electric, charged. Staff members she recognized turned their heads as she passed, confusion rippling through the hallway like a shock wave through water. The lobby doors opened and the world stopped. Daniel stood in full Army Ranger dress uniform, standing at perfect attention in the center of the marble floor. Behind him, a crowd had gathered, hospital administrators, nurses, security personnel. All of them watching. All of them waiting. When Daniel saw his mother, he came to attention, his back straightening further, his chin lifting. Then his arm rose in a salute so precise it could have cut glass. Senior Chief Petty Officer Morrison, he announced loud enough for the entire lobby to hear, loud enough for the fluorescent lights above to flicker in response. His voice carried the weight of something sacred. Katie stopped moving. For a moment, just one, she let the mast slip. She was a mother watching her son claim her in front of witnesses. She was a woman being called back into a life she'd tried to leave behind. Then she walked forward and returned the salute. A woman in an administrator's badge stepped into the space between them, trembling. Katie recognized her, the one who'd escorted her out 3 days ago, who'd refused to meet her eyes. Now the woman's hand shook as she held a folder, an actual physical file with Katie's name printed across the tab. "I've been instructed to read your record," the administrator said, her voice barely steady. 2 tours of duty. Sanjin, Helmand Province. Purple Heart. Commendation Medal. Service record marked exemplary across all evaluations. The crowd had gone so quiet you could hear the rain starting against the lobby windows. Then a man in navy dress white stepped forward from near the elevators. His rank insignia caught the light. He was a team leader, his presence carrying the terrifying fluid precision of someone who'd made life-and-death decisions before breakfast. His eyes locked on Katie's with the recognition that came from shared experience, from having survived the things that break normal people. "Senior Chief Petty Officer Morrison," he said, his voice pitched to carry through the entire lobby. "For your actions in Sanjin Valley. For your valor under fire. For leadership that saved lives in circumstances most people can't imagine." He paused, each word falling like an anvil. Navy Cross. Silver Star. 2 Bronze Stars for heroic action. Silence. Absolute silence. The kind of silence that only comes when the entire room's understanding of someone rewrites itself in real time. Sterling wasn't there. Katie's first thought was that he'd already fled, already understood that this moment meant the end of everything he'd built. But then the doors to the administrative offices burst open and 2 federal agents moved through the crowd with the singular purpose of people who'd already made their arrest decision 3 days ago. Dr. Richard Sterling, one of them called out, and Katie caught a glimpse of Sterling's face through the parting crowd. His face drained of all color, leaving him looking like a man who'd just realized the ground beneath him was sand. "You're under arrest for wire fraud, healthcare fraud, conspiracy, and attempting to tamper with federal records." The agent held up a warrant. "We've traced your attempt to forge Senior Chief Morrison's personnel records through federal databases. That triggered a full investigation into your financial transactions with MedSupply Solutions. We've recovered communications, payment logs, and evidence of kickback arrangements totaling $2.3 million over 4 years." Sterling tried to back away. The agent who'd been speaking simply moved closer, his hand resting on his belt in a way that suggested he'd been waiting for an excuse. "Your wife's attorney filed for divorce this morning," the second agent added almost conversationally. Your medical license suspension hearing is scheduled for next Thursday. The journal that was publishing your cardiac protocol research issued a retraction this morning when we informed them the data was fabricated. Katie watched Sterling's face collapse. Not into rage. Into the specific kind of devastation that only comes when you understand you've lost everything at once: your career, your credibility, your freedom, your reputation in front of the institution you'd spent years dominating. He looked small. Not because he was still 6'5", still broad-shouldered. But because the power that had made him dangerous was something that had lived inside him, and that power evaporated the moment the people around him learned who was actually standing in the room. They cuffed him and walked him toward the door, and not a single person in the lobby watched him go. Every eye remained on Katie. She stood beside her son in her scrubs, feeling the weight of recognition settle across her shoulders like body armor. Daniel's hand found hers, brief, steady. The Navy SEAL team leader stepped closer. "Welcome back, Senior Chief," he said simply. Katie's voice, when she found it, came from somewhere deep and steady. "Good to be back." She and Daniel walked out of Sacred Heart together as the rain began to fall harder, hammering the glass doors like applause, like the world remembering her name. Behind her, she felt her jacket lining where the unit patch was sewn, the one Daniel had placed there as a surprise last month, the one Lieutenant Webb had given to Daniel as a reminder of who his mother had been before pain tried to erase her. That evening, they sat in a coffee shop 3 blocks from the hospital, Katie and Daniel and Commander Hayes and Lieutenant Webb. Webb's color had returned over the past 72 hours. The needle decompression had saved his life, but it was something else that was bringing him back to himself, the knowledge that the woman who'd saved him was the legend he'd been hearing about for 2 years from Daniel, the senior chief petty officer who'd pulled his commanding officer from a burning Humvee in San Jin, the woman whose decisions under fire had shaped how he understood leadership and duty and what it meant to choose courage over comfort. "The fact that you were 3 miles away pulling people out of hell while I was running supply routes," Webb said, laughing, "and I never knew. Daniel's just been quietly dropping stories about his mom for 2 years, and I'm thinking she's impressive because she's a nurse. Then you saved my life with the kind of precision that only comes from having done it before." "When?" "Under fire?" "In a combat hospital." "All of the above," Katie said, and it felt strange saying it aloud, acknowledging it in the presence of witnesses who understood what those words meant. She drove home as the rain continued, feeling the patch against her heart, not the weight of memory anymore, but something lighter. The weight of being known. Of being seen. Of having walked away from a life she thought had destroyed her, only to discover that the skills forged in fire were exactly what her second life needed. The next morning, Katie returned to Sacred Heart, and the hospital administrator informed her of immediate reinstatement, back pay for the 3 days she'd been suspended, and a promotion to ICU charge nurse pending the hospital's formal investigation into Sterling's conduct. He was already gone, his office cleaned out by hospital staff who'd been instructed to do it in his absence, his nameplate removed from the door, his access codes deleted from the system. The investigation expanded. The board members who'd received referrals from Sterling were questioned by federal agents. 2 resigned within 48 hours. A third retained criminal defense counsel. The hospital issued a public statement apologizing to Katie Morrison for the suspension and acknowledging that she had been the subject of a targeted campaign of retaliation for refusing to participate in unlawful conduct. The news cycle lasted 5 days. Local nurse exposed kickback scheme, decorated veteran vindicated. Her face was in the Denver Post, her rank, her service record, the details of what she'd done in San Jin simplified into heroic language that felt both accurate and incomplete. She read the articles once, then didn't read them again. What mattered was that she went back to work. She walked into Sacred Heart the morning after her reinstatement in her scrubs, her badge restored, her hand steady as she moved through the ICU. The staff who'd avoided her before now made deliberate eye contact. The ones who'd been kind to her were openly friendly now, their respect no longer hidden. The ones who'd been cruel kept their distance, understanding without words that the hierarchy had shifted in ways they didn't control. She checked on Lieutenant Webb first. His recovery was progressing faster now, his oxygen saturation stable, his cardiac rhythm clean. When he saw her, he tried to sit up straighter. "Senior Chief. How are you?" "Better now," she said, and meant it. "How's the pain?" "Manageable. Listen, I wanted to tell you. The Army's offering me a desk position stateside if I want it. Medical Review Board probably isn't going to clear me for combat rotation for another 6 months anyway. I'm thinking about it." Katie adjusted his full line. "What does your wife think?" "She's crying happy tears. Wants me home. Wants to know you'll come to dinner sometime." He paused. "Daniel says you're finally accepting that you're allowed to have a life outside of Sacred Heart." Katie's hands didn't shake. "He says that, does he? He also says your therapist told you that visibility is not the same thing as vulnerability. That you can be known and still be safe." Katie made a note in his chart. "Your therapist sounds like he's got good ideas." "He does," Webb said quietly. "Your son's got good ideas too." That night, Katie sat on her apartment balcony, the unit patch in her hands. The faded green fabric, the embroidered Ranger tab, the airborne insignia. Daniel had found it in a box of her things, had kept it safe, had sewn it into her jacket lining as a way of saying, "I know who you were. I know who you are. You don't get to disappear." She'd fought that knowledge for 3.5 years. The meditation, the quiet job, the anonymity. All of it had been an attempt to be someone smaller, someone manageable, someone safe. But safety purchased through invisibility wasn't safety at all. It was just a different kind of breaking. She put the patch back in her jacket. Tomorrow she'd wear it to work, over her heart, and no one would see it except her. But she would know it was there. Lieutenant Webb would know it was there. Daniel would know. The Navy SEAL team leader would know. The people who'd raised her, trained her, fought beside her, they would all understand what that patch meant. It meant she'd stopped running. It meant she was finally, after all this time, coming home. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been underestimated and doubted, if you've ever had to walk toward the person who was trying to break you and choose composure over conflict, I want to hear from you. Subscribe for more stories of heroes in scrubs, warriors who chose healing over revenge, and the quiet strength of people who've learned that true power isn't a title. It's what you do when nobody's watching. Like this video, comment below, and tell me, have you ever been judged for your appearance and proven everyone wrong? What would you have done in Katie's position?